Hiyo, Neil Griffith here, and I'm here to comment on some of the Gamergate controversy and respond to Liana K, who is someone I respect and I hope to engage with in some debate with. We don't agree on everything, but that's okay because reasonable people are allowed to do that, and we don't engage in personal attacks on one another. At least I don't plan to, and I'm sure she doesn't either. The only thing I know about the Zoe controversy is what I've read about on other blogs, so I'm not going to go into that. I don't know anything about it, so I'm not touching it. But I will go into Anita Sarkeesian and the feminist frequency. Now, I know people who have been attending the atheist conventions for over a decade now, so they've known Anita Sarkeesian from way back when, before she decided to go after video games. And many of these people, like Jack Rawlinson and Thunderfoot, have said that she was an attention-whoring victim who sought to drag atheist forums off topic all the time and try to form a personality cult around herself. Anita Sarkeesian is basically a professional victim who has very unrealistic goals. You cannot kick women out of violent video games. You cannot kick sexy or sexualized women out of video games. That just can't happen. But that's the point. When you're a professional victim, last thing you want to do is actually solve the problems that you're complaining about. That's why she set up impossible goals in the first place. Because as long as the elements are there for her to complain about, and they always will be, she will always make a career out of complaining about them. So her future is set. There is always a lot of extreme negative reactions whenever you have any kind of Puritan movement. And I believe this, in my opinion, is a huge overreaction to Anita Sarkeesian and the feminist frequency, because I do not believe they stand any chance at all in banning the content that we like to see in video games. And I'm basing this upon my personal experience in the past of several Puritan movements that I lived through. And that's what this video is about. I'm going to describe these Puritan movements and, well, just a brief overall about what they were like and the overall effect that they had in the long term. And I think they were far more significant than the ones that we're facing today, in my opinion. And I'm going to try to prove that. My entire life, since I was a child, I have actively collected things that have pissed people off. And, well, here. Comic books with big boobies. Gore magazines with lots of horror in them. Heavy metal albums full of satanic lyrics. I've watched TV shows and lurid comedies full of drugs, nudity, and adult humor. Throughout my whole life, there has always been one Puritan movement or another to have all of this banned. And they all failed miserably. The two biggest, most significant ones I could think of in my personal history when I was growing up would have to be the Moral Majority and the PMRC. And those are the two that I'm going to go into in this video. Now, the first was obviously the Moral Majority. The Moral Majority is remembered as a huge failure and a joke. The founder of the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell, said himself on a live interview on CNN that the Moral Majority was a complete failure. That's out of his own mouth, is how he describes the Moral Majority. Now, the one thing that should be acknowledged by both the detractors and the supporters of the Moral Majority was there was a time when it wielded genuine power. The organization had among its ranks some of the most popular evangelical or televangelists of its time. Pat Robertson, Robert Grant, Jesse Helms, James Kennedy, Tim LaHaye, the men who wrote the Left Behind series books. Together, these televangelists had viewers that added up into the tens of millions. Millions of people who followed these evangelicals considered themselves to be members of the Moral Majority. At the height of its power, Jerry Falwell purchased $10 million worth of advertising time on the television to promote Ronald Reagan to get him elected as president in 1980. Falwell also used his church to promote the Republican Party. Now, to get a grasp of $10 million, it doesn't seem like a lot. $10 million is one commercial in the Super Bowl. But back in 1980, from 1980s dollars, to get that same amount of television coverage today would cost $100 million to $200 million. And take into consideration that the influence of television has been steadily declining since 1980. So that $10 million is a pretty big deal. It went pretty far to get Reagan elected. We have to take into account that in 1980, the Moral Majority was the largest political lobbyist for the conservative evangelical right wing. They had money, clout, power, and numbers in excess. But you may ask yourself, so what pissed off the Moral Majority? Well, it would be a lot easier for me to list things they didn't go after. They were angry with anything that was mainstream at the time. Well, here, they were pissed off with comic books. They were against stand-up comedians like Cheech and Chong, George Carlin, Richard Pryor, television shows like Saturday Night Live, Three's Company, Charlie's Angels, heavy metal bands like Kiss, Alice Cooper, AC/DC, and too many others to go into to mention. Basically all of them. They wanted to ban porn magazines. Falwell himself got into multiple lawsuits against Hustler and Penthouse magazine. The Moral Majority attacked any publication that promoted or was seen as soft on homosexuality, such as any publication that printed anything by the gay activists of the era, such as Jerry Sloan and Christopher Lampanero, who they got into lawsuits with. The Moral Majority heavily criticized and threatened litigations against magazines that publish satire of Puritan movements like Mad Magazine and Cracked. And finally, they went after anything that was that betrayed images of the macabre or anything that could be interpreted as Satanism, like Creepy, but there was also, very similar to this, Eerie Magazine, Fangoria, 1984, and Vampirella. Basically, the only thing from my childhood that they didn't go after was Lego and my $6 Million Man doll. Many of the things the Moral Majority did in protest had absolutely no effect whatsoever. When Kiss released the album Detroit Rock City, they were about to perform in Detroit. Jerry Falwell was on TV with the local news, and he called for his followers to go to the record album store and buy every single Kiss album they get their hands on and burn them to prevent children from getting their hands on them. Now, I remember this specifically because I lived not too far away. I was in the Bruce Peninsula in a town called Kincardine, which was only like 120 miles from Detroit. And my brother and I, we saw the broadcast, and we said, geez, we got to go to the store, spend our allowance to get the album, or we're never going to get our hands on it. So the first thing we did was we ran to the store and we bought a copy of Kiss Alive 2. Of course, there was one thing that we did not take into account. They'll just print more. Of course, when you're 12 years old, you're not thinking about that sort of thing. That's the nature of the medium that is meant to be copied easily. You could burn all the copies you want of Harry Potter. They'll just print more. So this crusade to wipe out Kiss albums just wound up temporarily making Kiss more money. So much so that they should have paid Jerry Falwell a commission. The Moral Majority was not a threat to heavy metal bands because the members of the Moral Majority are not the target audience that they count on to spend money on their albums and buy tickets to see their shows. But there was one way the Moral Majority was a genuine threat, especially with their numbers. They went after television shows. Now, one thing is that TV shows need advertising. The advertising pays for the paychecks of everyone involved in making a television show. That's how they make money. One I remember specifically they went after was Three's Company. That's because it had an unmarried man living in sin with two unmarried women. It showed an open tolerance towards homosexuality because the character Jack Tripper pretended to be gay so that the landlord would have no problem with a man living in the same apartment with two girls. Since the television shows earn their income from advertising, that's how everyone gets paid, the Moral Majority, made up of millions of people, threatened to boycott the companies that advertise products on those TV shows that they found offensive. And that had a genuine effect. Some television producers caved in and toned down the edginess of their shows, but many stood their ground and they openly thumbed their nose at the Moral Majority in TV shows like Saturday Night Live, Bizarre, Fridays, and even movies like Airplane 2.
She's starting to shake.
She's starting to shake.
She's starting to shimmy.
She's starting to shimmy.
However, it should be noted that some producers totally caved in on some productions, and they even had moral majority people on staff to dictate terms as to what was acceptable to have on their shows. One of the most famous was described in an interview in Penthouse magazine. They interviewed an animator that worked for Filmation who described in detail that there were people who worked for the moral majority on staff at Filmation who dictated how the TV show She-Ra was going to be filmed because they were unhappy with the way how He-Man was made. Now what happened was these people would come up with all kinds of amazingly insane, ridiculous rules. One of them was like, She-Ra should never do anything unladylike, like pick up a tank and throw it, despite the fact the whole point of the character is she's supposed to be a superpowered woman. Another thing they did was they came up with a rule that She-Ra was not allowed to make any decisions on her own without a man being present. Right out of the blue, they had to just invent this character that they had no intention of creating, so that just so they could drop him on scene whenever She-Ra had to come up with a plan to defeat the bad guys with. This guy would just pop up out of nowhere. And that's how they created this character called Bo, I believe it was. The animator that explained all of this claimed that the character they designed was actually designed by the moral majority themselves, and despite the fact that these evangelicals had a very stern stance against homosexuality, the character they wound up creating was the fruitiest, most flaming homosexual looking character that was ever put on any Saturday morning cartoon in the history of cartoons. Despite the fact the moral majority actually managed to do this, bully people onto production staff to alter the content of TV shows, they were ultimately an immense failure. So can you imagine a Puritan feminist movement bullying people onto staff at a game developer to dictate terms to them as to how video games are made? And even if they did, some other production company is just going to go, fuck the Puritans, we're going to make video games with big boobies in them and have them pound the crap out of each other. And we'll make money, and they can make the boring games, and we'll make the ones that guys actually want to play. The hell with who it pisses off. Which is exactly what already happened when Puritans were fighting to alter television shows and movies back in the 1980s. What proved to be a bigger threat than the moral majority against the music industry was the PMRC. That was the Parent Music Resource Center. A lot of people in support of the PMRC may claim that they actually achieved their goal of just putting warning labels on explicit music so parents would know what their kids were buying. It may have been what they settled for in the end, but this was clearly not the early intentions of the PMRC. The goal of the PMRC was to ban, criminalize, and ultimately destroy entire musical genres. Champion of the PMRC, Tipper Gore, made it clear she was happy to see people thrown in jail because of the music they created. Now try to imagine this scenario. A SWAT team kicks down the door of a game developer, charges down the hall, beats down the door of a production room, AR-15 rifles pointed everywhere. They find some guy at a computer, they grab him, they throw him to the ground, they handcuff him, they shoot his dog for no reason, and they read him his rights. You have been caught in the act of creating computer-generated image of big-breasted women in skimpy outfits for the purpose of using in a fighting game for public distribution. You are under arrest and are being charged with the something 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 in criminal code. If this actually happened in real life, can you imagine the outrage that would follow it? I mean, you could forget about any threats from Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Neckbeards like me are going to be bombing federal buildings all over the place. And yet, as unlikely as this scenario sounds, in reference to the music industry, this actually happened. In April of 1986, the police raided the home of Jello Biafra, the lead singer of the Dead Kennedys. The raid was in response to complaints by the PMRC. In June 1986, Los Angeles District Attorney Michael Guarino brought Biafra to trial in Los Angeles for distributing harmful materials to minors. in the Dead Kennedys album Frankenchrist. By the way, when he did this, it wasn't actually because of the lyrics in the album. It was because of the album cover art, which was drawn by H.R. Geiger, which had hardcore depictions of penetration and nudity. There was a mistrial, with the jury deadlocked 7-5 in favor of acquittal. Despite the appeal for a retrial, the judge ordered all charges to be dropped. Leading up to the trial, Tipper Gore made a public statement to a publication, a newspaper, that she would like to take credit for Jello Biafra's incarceration. When she was confronted by Jello Biafra on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Tipper Gore claimed to not remember saying that statement, and she said, "If I said it, then I retract it." But it doesn't take away from the fact that it actually happened and greatly illustrated the PMRC's wish to criminalize musical genres. When the industry agreed to put warning labels on their albums and the PMRC declared victory, they just simply moved the goalposts. But that does not in any way erase their original intentions. We're not going to forget what they did just to make life more convenient for the PMRC. But the good news is, when it came to explicit material, the onus was placed upon the parents to police the content that their children purchase. It was not the responsibility for the entire world to sanitize themselves so that children would never see harmful music or images. From a consumer's point of view, you can label an album whatever the hell you want. It doesn't matter as long as we still get to buy it. Activists supporting the feminist frequency and Anita Sarkeesian would like to believe that they can wield power like the PMRC and send SWAT teams to kick down the doors of game developers and have them hauled off to prison. But they don't, and they never will. Any threat of a boycott means absolutely nothing because they're not the target audience for the product, obviously. The industry already regulates itself with labeling for explicit content, so the government feels absolutely no pressure to get involved. As for having a voice in general and gaining political influence, there's plenty of women who think Anita Sarkeesian is full of shit. As a matter of fact, some of the very best rebuttals that I have seen against Anita Sarkeesian came from other feminists, like the Factual Feminist and Liana K. Considering what I've already lived through based upon my personal experiences, what chance does Anita Sarkeesian have in banning things that she doesn't like? Zip. Or even just influencing video games. Once again, zip. So people reacting so extremely by making death threats are just simply stirring up a storm in a teacup. However, I do believe there are some genuine issues about the portrayal of women in video games, and that a huge market is not being catered to because of it, because almost half the players out there are women. My personal solution to this is more video games. Instead of putting restrictions on content that we're already creating, we create more content that appeals to a different audience. Now, some people may react negatively to that because they say that they're afraid that stretching out the resources may hinder the development of content that they like. I personally disagree. I don't think that the release date for Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to get pushed back all because Rockstar made a fighting game full of androgynous characters or robots or something like that.